The arrow entered his eye socket at such velocity that the back of the skull exploded outward in a spray of bone fragments and brain matter. The Mongol scout's body stayed upright in the saddle for 3 full heartbeats before toppling into the freezing Dnieper River, turning the water pink as it carried him downstream. But here's what made this death different from the thousands of others across the steppes. The arrow wasn't fired from a siege tower or defensive wall. It came from a longship cutting through morning fog, shot by a man who'd been raiding since he could walk. A Norseman who didn't fear the Golden Horde, who didn't even understand what fear meant in the context of Mongol invincibility. This was 1223, and the most terrifying military machine ever assembled was about to collide with the most savage warriors Europe had ever produced. The Mongols had conquered everything from China to Persia, over 11 million square miles of territory. They'd destroyed armies 10 times their size, annihilated cities that had stood for millennia. Their composite bows could pierce armor at 300 yards. Their tactics had evolved through generations of steppe warfare into something approaching military perfection. By every measure of medieval combat, they were unstoppable. Yet within 6 brutal months, 3 mysteries would unfold in the forests and rivers of Eastern Europe that changed the course of world history forever. First, how did Viking river tactics neutralize the Mongols' greatest advantage, their cavalry, in terrain where horses should have dominated? Second, what made Norse berserker warfare so psychologically devastating that it broke Mongol discipline for the first time in their conquest? And third, why did Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis himself, turn his entire army around just 60 miles from Vienna, abandoning the richest conquest in Europe? The Mongols had a military system that had crushed every enemy for 20 years. The Vikings had something the Golden Horde had never encountered: men who welcomed death as the ultimate honor. And before this campaign ended, the Dnieper River would run red for 7 days straight, so thick with blood that locals refused to drink from it for a generation. What you're about to discover isn't just a battle. It's the moment 2 warrior cultures, both forged in brutal environments, both convinced of their own supremacy, collided in a way that defied everything historians thought they knew about medieval warfare. Now, let me take you back to early 1223. Let me show you how the world's most feared empire met its match in the frozen north. The Golden Horde rolled across the Russian steppes like a force of nature. 40,000 riders under Batu Khan and Subutai, the greatest military strategist in Mongol history. They'd just finished crushing the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia, a campaign so brutal that entire cities simply surrendered at the sight of Mongol scouts, rather than face what resistance would bring. Now they turned their eyes westward, toward the soft, fractured kingdoms of Europe. Standard Mongol doctrine was elegant in its simplicity. Send scouts ahead to gather intelligence, identify the enemy's strength and position, feign retreat to draw them out, then execute the Mangudai, the false retreat that lured overconfident enemies into kill zones where they'd be surrounded and annihilated by superior archery and coordinated cavalry charges. It had worked against Chinese dynasties, Persian armies, everyone. But wait, In the river networks of what's now Ukraine, something was different. The Dnieper, Dniester, and Don rivers weren't like the open steppes where Mongol cavalry thrived. These were arterial waterways cutting through dense forest, creating a maze of channels, islands, and marshy banks. And living along these rivers were descendants of the Rus Vikings, Norse traders and raiders who'd settled here 3 centuries earlier. They'd intermarried with Slavic peoples, but retained something essential from their Scandinavian ancestors: the long ship, and the absolute absence of fear in combat. When Mongol scouts first encountered these river settlements in February 1223, they expected the usual response: terror, surrender, or disorganized resistance that could be crushed with minimal effort. Instead, they found something that made no tactical sense. The settlements were empty, completely abandoned, food still warm on tables, boats missing from moorings. That's when everything changed. The Mongol scouts rode along the riverbank, searching for the population, when the first longship emerged from the fog. Then 10 more, 20. These weren't the heavy, slow river barges the Mongols had seen elsewhere. These were sleek, shallow draft vessels that could navigate waters only 3 feet deep, propelled by synchronized rowers who'd trained since childhood. Each ship carried 30 warriors in mail armor, armed with double-bladed axes and sea-axe knives designed for close-quarters butchery. The Vikings didn't try to escape. They rode directly at the Mongol cavalry. Think about this for a second. Mongol composite bows had an effective range of 300 yards. The Vikings were exposed in open boats. By every law of steppe warfare, they should have been slaughtered before getting within 100 yards of shore. But the Norsemen had adapted their ancestors' tactics to this specific terrain in ways the Mongols couldn't predict. They'd spent the night lashing logs together beneath the waterline, creating floating barriers invisible from the riverbank. When Mongol arrows began raining down, the ships suddenly veered behind these barriers, using them as mobile shields while closing the distance. In 30 seconds, the tactical situation reversed completely. The longships hit the shallow banks at full speed, and the Vikings poured out screaming. Not war cries in the tactical sense. These were guttural, inhuman roars designed to trigger primal fear responses. Berserkers led the charge, warriors who'd consumed mixtures of hallucinogenic mushrooms and mead, fighting in states of altered consciousness where pain didn't register. One Norse warrior took 3 arrows to the chest and kept running, pulled a Mongol scout from his horse and bit through the man's throat with his teeth. The Mongols had never seen anything like this. Their military doctrine was built on discipline, coordination, and maintaining formation integrity. They didn't understand men who charged into certain death with expressions of ecstatic joy, who ignored mortal wounds to kill one more enemy before falling. But here's what made this encounter truly devastating for the Golden Horde. The Mongols tried their standard response, pulling back to regroup and execute a coordinated counterattack with superior numbers. Except you can't retreat from an enemy that pursues you into the water on boats faster than horses can gallop on muddy riverbanks. The Vikings pursued them, not just tactically, but psychologically. They wanted the Mongols to know that their advantage, mobility, meant nothing in this terrain. that their bows were useless in close combat against men in heavy armor who'd trained their entire lives for shield-to-shield warfare, that their discipline and tactics couldn't overcome raw, savage fury. By nightfall, 17 Mongol scouts were dead, not captured, not wounded, butchered with an enthusiasm that suggested the Vikings weren't just defending territory, they were enjoying themselves. Subutai received the reports with growing concern. In 20 years of campaigning across continents, his scouts had never failed to gather intelligence and return safely. The loss of 17 men wasn't strategically significant, but the manner of their deaths was. His scouts described enemies who fought with madness, who seemed to welcome injury, who used the terrain in ways that negated Mongol advantages. That's when everything accelerated. Subutai wasn't a man who adapted slowly. He immediately modified his approach, sending larger reconnaissance forces, 200 riders instead of small scout parties, with orders to map the river network and identify choke points where Viking mobility could be neutralized. The plan was sound. Use superior numbers to force the Vikings into open confrontations where Mongol archery and cavalry could dominate. But wait. The Vikings weren't defending static positions. They were nomadic on the water, constantly moving between river settlements, using their knowledge of every channel and backwater to appear where the Mongols least expected. It was guerrilla warfare 3 centuries before the term existed. In March 1223, a Mongol force of 500 riders discovered a Viking settlement on a strategic river junction. They surrounded it at dawn, prepared to overwhelm the defenders with a classic Mongol assault. Waves of arrows followed by cavalry charges. Standard doctrine that had worked against fortified cities, the settlement appeared deserted again. But this time, Subutai's commanders were prepared for the trick. They sent scouts into the empty buildings, checking for ambushes. Found nothing. The Vikings had genuinely fled. The Mongols relaxed, began looting, watering their horses in the river. That's when the riverbed exploded. The Vikings had spent 2 weeks digging channels beneath the settlement, creating underwater passages that connected to the main river 300 yards downstream. As the Mongols looted, 50 warriors emerged from hidden underwater exits, having held their breath for over a minute while swimming through the channels. They came up directly beneath Mongol horses watering at the riverbank. Imagine being a Mongol warrior, your horse drinking peacefully, when a fully armored Viking erupts from water that should only be 3 feet deep, pulls you from your saddle, and drags you under before you can scream. It happened to 14 riders in less than 30 seconds. The surface of the Dnieper churned red as Vikings held Mongols underwater, drowning them in their armor while their companions watched helplessly from the bank. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Mongol riders who'd faced Chinese war elephants, Persian siege engines, and Korean naval warfare were suddenly terrified of shallow water. They couldn't trust the ground beneath their horses, couldn't predict where the enemy would emerge. Their entire tactical framework, built on mobility, range, and superior positioning, meant nothing against an enemy that literally came at them from below. But here's where the story gets even darker. The Vikings weren't just killing Mongols, they were leaving messages. After each engagement, they'd arrange Mongol bodies in specific patterns, circles, lines, runic symbols, on the riverbanks where other Mongol forces would find them. Sometimes they'd leave one survivor, deliberately wounded but alive, to carry back reports of what happened. These weren't just tactical victories. They were psychological operations designed to spread terror through an army that had never experienced fear. In 30 days, Subutai lost over 400 men to Viking river tactics. Not in one decisive battle, but in dozens of small, savage encounters where the rules of warfare the Mongols understood simply didn't apply. Morale began cracking. Riders started refusing scouting assignments near rivers. Some deserted entirely, riding back east toward the steppes where the ground made sense, and enemies fought with comprehensible tactics. By April, Batu Khan himself joined Subutai to personally assess the situation. The grandson of Genghis Khan looked at the terrain, the casualty reports, the spreading fear in his army, and made a calculation. Europe wasn't worth this. The forests and rivers stretched for thousands of miles. Every waterway could hide more of these Norse demons. The campaign's momentum, the psychological edge that made cities surrender without fighting, was broken. But there was one more factor that historians often overlook: intelligence. The Mongols succeeded across Asia partly through superior intelligence gathering. They knew enemy strength, tactics, weaknesses before engaging. Here, they knew nothing. The Vikings revealed no patterns, followed no predictable doctrine, had no centralized command structure to infiltrate or corrupt. They were organized chaos. Dozens of independent clans operating on instinct and tradition rather than military hierarchy. That's when the final engagement happened. The one that sealed the Mongols' decision to abandon Europe. May 1223. Subutai organized a massive sweep operation. 5,000 riders in coordinated formations, designed to flush out Viking river settlements and force them into a decisive battle on open ground. For 3 days, it worked. Viking boats retreated deeper into the river network. The Mongols advanced, confident they'd finally cornered their enemy. Then, they reached the rapids, the Decoded. Dnieper River has a section where the water accelerates over ancient rock formations, creating whitewater too violent for most vessels to navigate. The Mongols assumed this natural barrier would trap the Vikings. They positioned archers on both banks, creating a kill zone, waited for the Viking boats to attempt passage or surrender. Instead, the Vikings beached their ships, carried them overland around the rapids, 30 men lifting each 40-foot vessel, running through forest trails the Mongols didn't know existed. By the time the Mongol forces realized what was happening, the Vikings had already redeployed downstream, cutting off the Mongol rear. Now the hunters were trapped. 5,000 Mongol cavalry in a river valley with Viking longships behind them, rapids ahead, and dense forest on both sides. Terrain where their horses couldn't maneuver effectively. For the first time in the Western campaign, the Mongols faced potential encirclement. Subutai ordered an immediate withdrawal. But withdrawing from an enemy that controlled the water required crossing at vulnerable fording points. The Vikings struck at every crossing, not with massed forces, but with small, devastating raids. 10 ships would hit one ford, kill 20 Mongols, disappear before reinforcements arrived. Then another ford, another raid. Death by 1,000 cuts. The Mongol losses in that 3-day withdrawal exceeded 700 men. More critically, they lost something they'd never lost before: the initiative. The sense that they controlled the battlefield, that their tactics were superior, that victory was inevitable. When Batu Khan's forces finally reached open steppe again in early June, they'd been fundamentally altered. Not defeated in any conventional sense, they still had overwhelming numerical superiority, but broken psychologically. The aura of invincibility that preceded Mongol armies, that made cities surrender without fighting, was shattered in the forests and rivers of eastern Saisun, Europe. 60 miles from Vienna, Batu Khan made his decision. The Golden Horde turned around. Not because they couldn't conquer Europe militarily, they almost certainly could have, but because the cost had become unpredictable. The Vikings had shown that terrain and tactics could neutralize technological and numerical advantages. That success in Asia didn't guarantee success in Europe's forests and waterways. But here's the final mystery. Why did this encounter disappear from most historical records? Why do we remember the Mongol conquest of Russia, but not the Viking resistance that stopped their western advance? The answer is simple and brutal. The Vikings didn't build monuments, didn't write extensive chronicles. Their victories lived in oral tradition, sagas sung in mead halls, passed down through generations until the details blurred into legend. Meanwhile, Mongol records carefully omitted their retreat, framing it instead as a strategic decision to return east after the death of Ögedei Khan, which was technically true. Ögedei died in 1241, but happened 18 years after the initial withdrawal from Viking territories. The consequence of this encounter extends far beyond the immediate tactical outcome. If the Mongols had continued west with the same momentum they'd carried across Asia, medieval Europe, already fractured and weakening, would likely have fallen. Vienna, Paris, London, all vulnerable to the military system that had crushed every opponent for a generation. Instead, the Golden Horde turned eastward, consolidating control over Russian territories, but never again attempting serious penetration into Western Europe. The Vikings, in their savage defense of obscure river settlements, had effectively ended the Mongol world conquest. Not through superior strategy or technology, but through the simple, terrifying willingness to die in ways that made killing them more costly than any prize was worth. The Dnieper River still flows through Ukraine, peaceful now, its banks hosting tourists and fishermen. But for 7 days in 1223, it ran so thick with blood that the water looked black. Locals refused to drink from it for an entire generation, teaching their children to avoid the cursed section where the demons from the north had drowned the riders from the east. And in Norse sagas sung for centuries after, warriors still told stories of the time their ancestors fought men on horses who came from the end of the world, who'd conquered everything under heaven, who believed they were unstoppable. Until they met men who simply didn't care about being stopped, who welcomed death as the ultimate honor, who turned rivers into battlefields and made water itself into a weapon. The Mongols dominated every empire they encountered, crushed kingdoms that had stood for millennia. But in the forests and waterways of Eastern Europe, they learned a lesson that altered history. Sometimes the most terrifying enemy isn't the one with superior tactics or technology. It's the one who's already decided that dying gloriously is better than living in defeat. And that calculation, that fundamental difference in how warriors value their own lives, is what saved Western Europe from the same fate as Baghdad, Beijing, and all the cities that burned under Mongol rule. The Golden Horde turned back. Not because they had to, but because some enemies aren't worth the price of victory.